Good morning, everyone. I'm going to give it a couple of minutes as people join today before I jump into the material we're going to be covering. I think I'll give it until about 4 to 5 minutes after 10 a.m. If you have any questions before we jump in, feel free to use the chat box. You can send a message either directly to me or you can send a message that everybody can see. There's also a question and answer feature here where you can ask a question and then I can post an answer that everyone can see. Questions can either be anonymous or you can ask them with your name. Um, so as we get started here and we are waiting for people to join, I'm going to share a little introductory poll with you guys just so that I can get to know you a little bit and get an idea of who is joining me here today before we jump in. When we are doing in-person SAT boot camps, I can generally just scan the room and interact with you guys much more easily than I can when it is a virtual workshop bootcamp experience. So I'm going to launch this poll, and if you can just vote for whichever one applies best to you. So there are 5 questions here. The first one is, what is your goal score for the SAT? And these are just ranges. You'll see I put a plus sign next to each score, which basically means this is the minimum that you would be happy with. Anything above that would be great. And then also what grade you're in, if you want to go in-state or out of state, if you're aiming for bright futures, if you need more help with math or reading and grammar. We're going to be covering all of the SAT sections today. But if I see there's really a lot more help needed with one, we can maybe stay a little bit after or open up questions at the end of our session today to look a little bit more in depth at whichever one you guys need more help with. So for those of you who don't know me through the Safety Harbor Public Library or through private tutoring or other courses that I offer, my name is Carla Berry, and I have been doing SAT and ACT prep for more than a decade. So I started out working for some of the big name test prep companies, and I taught classes for them and I tutored for them. And after a couple of years of doing that, I went off on my own and I started my own business and have been working for myself for quite some time now. So this is what I do full time. I have spent thousands of hours going through SAT and ACT questions. Today we're in the SAT Bootcamp, so that's what we're going to be focusing on. But I've really spent some time getting acquainted with every single question. And we are going to be referencing a core concepts and critical thinking skills handout today quite a bit. And the way that handout was created, one summer I spent a couple of months just really combing through every single SAT question that has ever been released by the College Board. And I evaluated each question as how often do I need to teach students this concept during private tutoring? How often do I find that students are giving up easy points because they don't know this concept? And also, how frequently does this concept appear on SATs? So there are certain concepts that are good to know, but they're not super likely to actually appear on your test on test day. And those concepts are not going to be in this guide. I'm sure you noticed it's pretty short. There's not a ton of information in here. And I have found that students score in the 1300s, 1400s, even the 1500s, only learning what is in this guide. So I am sure you have seen those really big test prep manuals that are just giant and have so many concepts and formulas and equations in them. And it can be hard to determine what do you really need to know. And I'm here to tell you today what you really need to know to go in and be successful is going to be in this core concepts and critical thinking skills handout. Before you move beyond this and study other concepts and equations and formulas, and rules, I would make sure that you know whatever is in this guide 100%. So let's see here some of the responses we have so far. So it looks as if most of you are aiming for 1300 plus on the SAT, which tells me that you are probably aiming for that full Bright Future scholarship. I'm also seeing quite a few juniors, but we also have some 9th and 10th graders in here. And for those 9th and 10th graders, if you are going to be taking the PSAT and even the juniors, what you learn in SAT prep also applies to the PSAT. The PSAT is going to be a little bit more simplified than the SAT, but everything you need to know for the SAT, you also need to know for the PSAT. So this will also help you for that. It also looks like most of you want to stay in state. Definite 96% of you are attempting to qualify for Bright Futures, which is a good goal to have. That's free money for college, basically. And then it's almost an even split between the math and verbal sections. I have a couple more votes for the math section, but it seems pretty even. And we'll be covering all of those. So I'm going to leave this poll open just for a little bit longer. And we are first going to dive into the Determining Your Target Score handout. And for those of you that did not receive my email, I am going to just share it here in the chat box. Let's see. Yes, there we go. So you should see a link appear in the chat box, and that's a link to an email that I sent out last night and this morning that has all of the materials that we'll be using today in it. And I will also be sending a follow-up email after this bootcamp is over today with the answer key for both the core concepts and critical thinking skills and the SAT that we'll be using today. So if you don't have time to print it out or you don't have a pencil and paper handy, you'll still be able to reference those. So don't stress out if you're not able to write things down fast enough. Okay, so let's dive into the Determining Your Target Score handout here. And I'm just going to share my screen. Here we go. So determining your target score. I always begin here with test prep, because if you don't know what score you need, you're going to have a really hard time to know what is required to get there, right? So if I have a student that wants a SAT score of 1,000 plus, you're going to have a different prep experience than a student aiming for 1,300 plus or even 1,200 plus. For schools within Florida, which most of you are interested in, you're going to want to Google what is the 50th percentile for admitted applicants? What is the class profile for 2020 or 2019? And then make sure that your SAT score falls above that 50th percentile in order to be competitive. So for UF, SAT score ranges tend to be 640 to 730 for the math section and 640 to 710 for the verbal section. So in order to be a competitive applicant, you want to make sure that you're scoring in the upper 600s on each section of the SAT for UF. So I want to add a word of caution when you're looking at SAT scores and you're studying. I would never advise a student not to apply to a college or university just because their SAT score is a little lower than what that 50th percentile looks like. That's just going to fall in your reach category for when you're applying. So you want to apply to schools that are safeties, that have SAT score requirements, GPAs, that are a little bit lower than what yours will be. So when you apply to that school, you'll think, I probably will get into that school. That's a safety. A match school will be one where your stats really match up very closely to what the admitted cost profile looks like for that school. And then reach schools will be ones where your SAT score or GPA maybe falls a little bit short. So I wouldn't totally eliminate those, but I wouldn't make those the only schools that you apply to, because I really like for students to get accepted to more than one university so that when time comes to make a decision, you can really compare those financial aid offers and go to one that's the best fit for you. So when you look at this, take it with a grain of salt. As something to aim for, but don't dismiss it as an option if you don't quite reach that goal. I had a student who, for this last admission cycle, applied to the UF honors program, and the student's SAT score was well below what UF honors applicants generally have. But the personal statement and extracurricular activities set that student apart, and the student still got into UF honors. With a full ride with Bright Futures. Okay, so Bright Futures. I guess those graduating in 2020, I can almost take it off of this handout now, since those graduates have already graduated. For those graduating in 2021 and beyond, which I think is everyone here with me today, you're going to need an SAT score of either 1210 or 1330 and above. So the 1210 will give you partial Bright Futures, and the 1330 will give you full Bright Futures. The full Bright Futures scholarship, the FAS, also has a little bit higher of a GPA requirement. And I just want everyone to be really careful with this GPA. So you can see that it is weighted, but it does not take into account all of your classes. So let's say you received a A in band. That's great that you got an A in band, but it's not going to be counted towards your Bright Futures GPA. Bright Futures only looks at your core classes. So they're going to be looking at your math, your science, English, and so forth. So those elective classes won't count towards your GPA minimum. So I have worked with students that reach the SAT requirement and they have the service hours, but then when they calculate their GPA, it just doesn't quite match up. One thing you can do is really talk to your guidance counselor and see if you can take another class to substitute for a class that maybe you didn't do so well in. You can also retake certain classes to bring up that GPA. I think it's 100% worth it to do that in order to get access to more scholarships. And then let's see, tomorrow night, I don't know how many of you are signed up for it already. I'm going to be talking specifically about college applications for this upcoming admission cycle, specifically about test optional and where is Florida headed for that. So some of these schools have announced already that they are not going to count it against students if they don't submit test scores. And some schools have said, no, you still need test scores. That can also change for admission versus scholarship. So I'm going to go in depth about that tomorrow night. I'm not going to go too in depth on it today. It will just take up way too much time. So finding our target score for an SAT of 1330, the nice thing about that for Bright Futures is they don't really care how you get that 1330. You can super score the 1330. That means you can take the SAT more than once and take your best math score from one sitting and your best verbal score from another sitting. So you can super score for your 1330. They also don't care if your math score is super high and your verbal score is super low, or vice versa. They just want you to hit that mark of 1330. However you get there is up to you. So to keep this simple, let's say we're gonna round that 1330 up to a 1400. I always like students to aim a little bit higher than what they actually need on test day. And there are two reasons for this. One is going to be each test day is scaled a little bit differently. So this is a curved test unofficially, meaning that on some days you can miss 2 math questions and get a 780. And then on another day, maybe you miss 2 math questions and that's a 750. So they're going to vary slightly from test day to test day. You can go on Reddit and Google and read all about people's predictions about which test day is going to be easier than another one, but there really is no way to predict that. So just be prepared that you want to aim a little bit higher than what you need in practice and really be prepping for that. If you hit that mark, great, that's amazing for your college applications. If you fall a little bit short, then you have still met your goal. So that's going to be really important for this. So let's say we need a 700 in math. That means you need to answer 50 out of 58 questions correctly, which I think is a reasonable goal. I think it is totally possible when you put in the practice to get a 700 in math, or to fall short a little bit. And let's say you get a 650, you just had a bad day on test day. You get a 650, that's still 44 out of 58. That is 14 questions that you can get wrong. That is more than half of the no calculator math section. So that is a lot of wiggle room for you to still be able to do amazingly well. Then for the verbal score, it gets a little bit more complicated. So for the verbal score, we have to kind of cross match between the reading and the writing. So for a 700 verbal, you would need to get a 35 scaled score in reading and a 35 writing and language. So a 35 writing and language is going to be 39 out of, let's see here, 44 questions correct. So you could miss about 5 questions, which is really not that much. That's not a lot of wiggle room. And then for the reading test, that's going to be 43 out of 52 questions. So you have a little bit more wiggle room. And again, it doesn't matter if you're answering more reading correctly and maybe you're missing more grammar or vice versa, as long as you hit that mark combined. That's mainly what colleges are going to be looking at. I have never really heard about a college zooming in to see, hey, did you get that 700 verbal because you were really great at the reading section or the grammar section? They just look at the 700 verbal. That's all they're going to see. The same for the math score. They are not going to see, did you get your math score because you're really great at the calculator section or because you're great at no calculator? They have no idea. They just see your math score. They have no clue whether you're answering easy, medium, or hard questions correctly. Let's see here. Oh, so somebody asks, how many times do you say you could retake the SAT? I would keep retaking it until you get the score that you need. But something to keep in mind is for most students, unless you have a fee waiver, I think if you get a free lunch, you get a couple of SATs for free. But if you're paying for it, I would make sure that on practice tests, you are scoring somewhere near where you want to be scoring on test day before you are paying for retakes. I wouldn't make all those retakes be used as practice for the SAT. But I have had students that retake it quite a few times and they ultimately hit their goal. I actually had a student almost 10 years ago who really struggled with standardized test taking, and she was one of the most motivated students I have ever met. And she took the ACT a handful of times, the SAT a handful of times. She just would not stop until she could hit the Fulbright Futures mark because she wanted to go to college debt-free. And she ended up going to FSU. Now she has her master's from FSU, and she works in Tallahassee as a lobbyist. And no one knows that this girl took the SAT and ACT combined probably more than 10 times. No one knows the history behind it. So definitely be motivated and really be determined to hit your goal there. So there should, somebody else asked if there's going to be another free test for juniors since the one on March 25th was canceled. And I do believe so. From what I've heard so far, there will be another free testing opportunity to make up for the one that you guys missed out on. So yes, that has been taken care of by the schools. You will hear about that. You can also contact the College Board directly or your guidance counselor directly to see what your school has planned for that. Okay, so let's dive in to which test dates you guys can take. So the June one, this one has not been updated, this handout, but the June one is out, right? And now they've added a September test date, and they're sold October, November, December. So they have made it so that you have an opportunity every month to take the SAT this fall. Something to keep in mind with SAT test dates, for some of these dates, they release a QAS. So that's going to be the March, May, and October test dates historically. This may change a little bit as they have added new test dates and adjusted what they were already offering. So the QAS provides you with both the questions and the answers that you missed on testing. And if it's going to be the first time that you take the SAT, I really like for students to take it on a day where the QAS is offered. That gives you the opportunity to see both your questions and your answers. And it gives you a little bit more insight into what do you maybe need to work more on in the future. Just seeing that you missed an algebra question, which is what they would tell you for the other test dates, really doesn't tell you specifically what is the concept that you are missing, that you need to fix for the next time you take the SAT. Okay, so I'm going to end that poll and I will share the results with you guys too, if you want to look those through as we go through the core concepts and critical thinking skills handout. So for the core concepts and critical thinking skills, as I mentioned at the very beginning of our session today, we are going to really need to know this stuff to do well on the SAT and even the ACT if you're planning to take that also. This is not something that I would brush aside and think, hey, I don't really need to know this. This is super important stuff. For naturally great test takers, you're going to find that they do this without even thinking. But test taking, luckily, is something that we can learn to be better at. And really focusing on the general test taking concepts will make you a better test taker in the future. Okay, so let's look at the common errors. So these are going to be reasons that students get questions wrong. We need to understand why are we getting things wrong in order to start getting them right. The number one reason that students get questions wrong on the SAT, and this I think is one of the most surprising things ever, in my experience, it's not going to be because the student doesn't know the concept or never learned the concept. That is not going to be the reason. The reason, so lacking knowledge, is not going to be the number one reason. Instead, it's going to be that the student misread the question. So they thought the question was asking something else than what the question was actually asking. And whatever they thought the question was asking, they answered that correctly. But surprise, surprise, that is not what the question was asking. So just misreading the question. Using the wrong information is going to be another really classic reason for you to get a question wrong. And then bubbling in the wrong answer, which I think is just so ridiculous that this is even a thing, but even I can do this if I'm rushing through and I'm not being really careful to avoid it. I have seen students circle the right answer and then bubble in the wrong one. I have even seen a student or two write down the right number in the math free response questions and then write down a totally unrelated number in the grid-in part for that question, which I don't even know how that happens, but it's possible. So you have to really be on your game and be double checking that you are bubbling the right letter. You are writing down the right number, that you're using the right information. If they tell you to use table 1, make sure that you're using table 1. If they are asking you to find the area of a sector, you are not finding the area of the circle, right? If they're asking you to solve for X, you're not solving for Y. If they're asking you what happened in the introduction of the passage, you're not looking at the final paragraph. So you really need to be careful because it's designed to throw you off sometimes. And they want to see, are you a good critical thinker? Can you really interpret these questions and find the right information? Another big thing that I want everyone to note is knowing when to skip. So this is going to be a game changer for you on test day if you are comfortable skipping a question. So you're just bubbling in a guess, and then you are starring the question or circling it. Figure out which one you want to use, starring or circling, and then just be consistent on that when you're taking practice tests to remind yourself when you are at the end of the test and you have some time left over to go back that you need to go double check these questions because those were guesses and you skipped them. So getting comfortable with knowing when to skip will be huge, really, really huge for you. So if I read a question and it's not immediately apparent to me what the answer is, or it's confusing, or I find myself rereading the question because it's just not that clear, that is going to be a skip for me because I don't want to spend too much time on any single question. Every single question on the SAT has the same point value. There's no such thing as this is a really hard question, so you're going to get 10 points, and this is an easy question, so you're only getting half a point. Each question is worth the same point. You're getting the same point for an easy question as a medium question as a hard question. And there is no gold star for answering one really hard question or one hard, confusing question that's maybe just confusing to you, and then giving up 3 easy points for the sake of wasting all your time and mental energy on that hard question. Also, if questions are really long and you can see, hey, I'm gonna have to read a lot and do a lot of work to get an answer for that question, I may choose to skip it and come back at the end. Something to note though, when a question is really long, I'm going to skip to the very end of that paragraph, if it's a paragraph question, and see what is the actual question. The last sentence of the paragraph, 99% of the time will be the actual question. And then I will determine, is this an easy question, medium, or hard? If I think it's easy, I will just go ahead and answer it. If I think, oh, this is going to be confusing, I don't really know what's going on here, I'm going to have to think about this, I'm going to come back to it. And then remember, you're always bubbling in a guess. There is no guessing penalty on the SAT. So I always get really funny guessing questions from students about, is it okay if I Christmas tree? Or can I just pick a letter of the day? How do I guess? Or I got 3 B's in a row and I hadn't gotten a single D on the test, so I picked D as my guess. So those are going to be pretty poor guessing strategies. And later on today, as we're looking at questions, I'll show you how to make an educated guess based on the information they give you. And it's going to be different for each section of the SAT, how we're going to guess. But we're not just going to randomly bubble in numbers or letters. And then avoiding fatigue. So avoiding fatigue and skipping kind of go hand in hand. They're buddies. Because if you are not skipping and you are getting stuck on questions and spending way too much mental energy on it, unfortunately, you are most likely going to be burning out on those questions. And that's going to make you more fatigued for other questions that maybe you would have gotten correct if you didn't burn out on that one question. So we really want to make sure that we are using the easiest way to answer a question. Even if we maybe know another harder way, we're always going to go the easy route and make sure that we're not burning out. Because if you're burning out on one section, then it's going to come back and cause problems for you in the next section. Because remember, for the SAT, we are taking all the sections on the same morning. They don't let you leave the school and then come back another day to take another section. So we have to be careful to not burn out. And then guessing, I kind of already touched on that, but we will circle back to how to guess on each section of the SAT. We are always, for any section that we're going to be guessing, we're going to see if we can eliminate one or two answer choices first. Just by eliminating one or two, if you are just randomly guessing, you're going to increase the likelihood that you're going to guess correctly. And then we'll see how to look for patterns and so forth in each section. So tracking your progress. So I can't tell you how many times you should take the SAT. That's going to be a personal decision for you. How many times can you afford to take the SAT? What grade are you in? I can tell you to aim to take it as few times as possible. And the more competitive school you're applying to, if you have Ivy League dreams, then you really need to not be taking it too many times. But I can tell you to take the 10 practice tests that are available from the College Board online. So I would really take the time to work through every single practice test that they have released before you go and sit down and take the real SAT on test day. Each practice test will teach you lessons. And the more familiar you get with the SAT as you're working through those practice tests, the more you will start to recognize the patterns in the questions and seeing how they're just basically recycling the same material. They're changing the numbers and the scenarios slightly, but they're not really reinventing the wheel. Maybe for each test, they'll have one or two questions that are just a little bit out there that you're really going to need to be thinking through. But for the most part, they are recycling the same things, and you will become more confident in spotting that when you're working through practice tests. I have a column here for you to retake to reinforce the concepts. And that's going to be especially true for the math section. So after you have taken an SAT practice test and you've scored each section and you've looked over what should you do differently to answer questions the next time correctly, you need to go back for the math sections and retake the entire math section again to make sure that you remember how to do it correctly the next time. This is going to be a critical step to increasing your SAT math score. Without this step, you will just not see the same improvement. So you take the whole SAT practice test, you score everything, and then for the math section, you're going to need to retake. For math, you also need to make sure on those retakes that you are showing all of your work. So if you happen to have a really good memory and you remember for question 1, the answer was B, and then you look at B and you know, I know the answer is B, but I don't know why, I don't know what equation to use. I don't remember that calculator thing I'm supposed to use here, but it's B. Avoid the temptation of circling B. Circle that question as, hey, I still don't know that. And don't give yourself that point. That way, when you're done taking that retake, you can go back and remember, hey, I really need to look at this the next time. I don't know this super well. So for today, I'm going to cover SAT math first, because I think that can be a little bit more tiring. So I want you guys to get that exposure before we look at the verbal sections. I think the verbal section's a little bit more of a break, a little bit. Somebody asks, would it be better to write down all of the ways to solve certain questions while you're doing them? It depends on the question. When I am working with students, I will show them a lot of the time more than one way to answer the same question, but really you can just write down your way. So whichever way you find best that you can write down. If you are looking at my solution after the fact or the College Board solution and you see, ooh, there's an easier way, just note that and attempt using that way the next time. Okay, so SAT math. So this is going to be one page front and back. And before you go take the SAT this fall, how many of you are taking it in August? Do you have the ability to raise your hand in this? Yeah, how many of you? Quite a few. So there's a couple of you taking it in August. If you are taking it later this year even, you want to make sure, and this is the one thing I really, really want for you, is to have this math strategy, the 2 pages front and back, absolutely memorized. So if you have to take it bit by bit and put it on flashcards, if you need to rewrite it a bunch of times, if you have to print it out, if you have to have a parent or sibling or friend quiz you on it, you really want to know this stuff, because I promise you, it will appear on your SAT. And the last thing you want to happen on your SAT is finding a parabola question and thinking, oh, if only I memorized the vertex form, or you come across a arc length question and you're like, darn it, I didn't memorize that arc length equation and now it's on here. Or even worse, if you are so not familiar with this that you don't even make the connection when you see the question that it was on this handout. But I will tell you that when I'm working with students with the SAT, I am going back to this core concepts handout time and time again. It gets annoying sometimes, I'm sure, for students when they miss a question and I say, okay, let's go look in the core concepts. And they will time and time again tell me, it's not in there. I looked, I couldn't find that. And I'll say, it's right here. And that is where the key lies, is relating this handout to the questions on the test. If you can get to the point where you're reading a question and you think, oh, this is going to be a factoring question, you are already ahead of the game than your fellow students. Yeah, so this should already be in your email. So definitely check your email for one from me. The blank copy is already in your email. I already sent it out. And after our session today, I'm going to send you the key. So anything I'm writing in here today, you will have also. So just to give you an idea of what to expect as we go through each section of this today, I'm going to take you through the math strategies. So what do you need to know for the math section? And then we will take, let's say, a 2-minute break. And then I'm going to have you answer some math questions. So that's going to give you an opportunity to answer them on your own. I'll set a timer, give you the chance to answer them, and then I'll hop back in and we will look at those questions before we move on to the next section. So I've done quite a few of these boot camps, and after our boot camp today, I will also send you out a survey of what did you really like about it? What do you want more of next time? Do you have any suggestions? And the one suggestion I always get from students is that they love the opportunity to try their hands at a question before I show them how to solve it. So I'm going to make sure that we do it that way for most of the questions today. Okay, so let's see here. First, we're going to zoom in. And this is going to be really important for us to remember because we're going to do the opposite in the reading section. So for the reading section, we're going to be zooming out. And for SAT math, we're going to be zooming in to see exactly what is important for that question. The SAT is famous for giving you additional information that you don't really need, or making it seem a little bit more complicated than it actually is. So first step is always going to be, what is the concept that this question is testing me on? We're also going to be really wary of the 2-part questions. And this will be where you are first solving for X and they actually want Y. Or you solve for X and Y, but they don't want X and Y. They want 2X plus 3Y. So your X and Y are pretty useless. And this is where the SAT gets a little bit meaner than the ACT, because if you solve for X and you forget to plug X back in to solve for Y, you can be guaranteed that the X will be an answer choice, an incorrect answer choice, but it will be right there to tempt you. On the ACT, generally, they don't do that. But on the SAT, they definitely do. Then thinking. So before we jump in and do the problem, we have to take a step back and think about what is the math concept that this question is addressing, and also what would be the simplest way to solve it. I'm going to show you a classic think question from SAT practice test number 10. Let's go into it here. And this was the actual SAT in October 2018. So students actually had to answer this on that SAT. So for number 19, they say 2x plus 3y equals 1200, 3x plus 2y equals 1300. Based on the system of equations above, what is the value of 5x plus 5y? And I'm going to just give you a minute to think through this question about how you would solve it. What would you use? Would you use substitution or elimination, or would you use something else? So let's just think about it for a second. So there was more than one student that took the SAT, probably hundreds, probably thousands. I would dare say there were thousands of students who took this SAT in the fall of 2018 and got this question wrong, and they used substitution or elimination. So let's say they multiply this equation by 2 and this equation by 3, so that this would become a 4 and a 6, and this would become a 9 and a 6, and then they subtracted the 2 equations to get rid of the y, and then they solved for x, and then they plugged that back in. Or they solved for x in one of these equations and then substituted that back in the other equation. But we have a couple of clues for this question. And when we zoom in and we think about what is the easiest way to solve these questions, and as you improve your familiarity with SAT math questions, you will note a couple of things here. First thing is we are in the no calculator math section. That means we cannot use our calculator, and we want to keep it simple. So we do not want to do anything that's going to require us to show a whole page of work. And that's what would happen here if I use substitution or elimination. The next thing I notice is they gave me a systems of equations. There's a system. There's 2 equations here and 2 unknowns. And then the last clue is the most important. They are asking what is 5x plus 5y. And whenever the SAT does this, whenever they're not just asking for X and they're not just asking for Y, the very first thing I'm going to do is see what happens when I simply add the equations together, or I subtract one equation from the other one without doing anything else. So you can draw a line right here and then add them. So that's 2x plus 3x is 5x, 3y plus 2y is 5y, and 1200 plus 1300 is 2500. And there we have our answer. 5x plus 5y is just 2500. So it's going to be super important for you guys to zoom in and think, pause. Hey, what can I do here? What concept are they testing me on before you just dive in? Let's see. I already told you the importance of memorizing. Anything in this handout for the math section, you absolutely need to know before you go into the SAT. 100%. Strategy. So we're always going to look for patterns and pick the most reasonable answer choice. So if we are dealing with a percent problem. And they say that the original price was discounted, and then we had this new price of 100. What was the original price? Let's say the new price is 100. That means the original price before the discount had to be bigger than 100. So any answer choice less than 100, we can just eliminate. So always think about, hey, what is reasonable here before you just dive into the question. You can also look and kind of be lazy, and we'll see as we go through some of those math questions how to be lazy and effective, using the answer choices to guide you for what you're going to solve for. So let's say they want the midpoint. We know the midpoint is going to be x1 plus x2 over 2 and y1 plus y2 over 2. That's our midpoint. And let me actually move this to the midpoint part of this handout, which is on your back page over here. So let's say they're asking you for the midpoint. I would first look at the answer choices and see, are all my x values different or all my y values different? And if all my x values are different, I'm just going to solve for the x coordinate of the midpoint. I'm not going to take the time to solve for both. That's kind of lazy, but we're also just zooming in on what do we need to do to get that question correct. And then, as I said before, we're going to keep track of time, right? We're going to make sure that we are collecting all our easy points first before we attempt the hard questions. The SAT math section actually goes in order from easy, medium, to hard. So we can kind of see what's going on there. Something to note with that though, and this gets really tricky, I think. For SAT math, once we get to the grid-in questions, the free response questions, so it starts out with multiple choice, and then you get this page, and then it's grid-in questions. And this right here is a little aha moment, a pause of it's about to get easier again. So we have to take a deep breath here and make sure that we are not overcomplicating the first free response question. And I am the queen of overcomplicating. So I cannot even tell you how many times in a no calculator math section, I read question number 16 and I think to myself, that is really complicated. What's going on here? And then I skip it because my brain is firing after I answer the most complicated multiple choice questions. I'm on a different wavelength. So I'm skipping the easy one. I'm going to the more difficult concepts, which would be question numbers 19 and 20. And I'm doing those, and then I'm coming back to question number 16 at the end and just slowly thinking through it. And then I see, aha, this was actually not that bad. So definitely knowing how to approach that will be super important. Picking easy questions first, answering those before you move on to hard questions, and remembering you get the same point for an easy question as a hard question. So I'm going to make sure that I am showing my work for all questions and that I am not making a silly mistake on an easy question that makes me give up that point. I have seen students' SATs come back when they take the SAT on one of those QAS dates where I can see both the questions and their answers. And time again, I will see really smart students who are already in advanced math. They're taking AP Calc. They are just rocking math. And their test comes back and they got a lot of the hard questions right, but the easy questions is just a total mess for them. When we look at the easy questions, we just see silly mistakes, silly mistakes, silly mistake all over the place. Not because they don't know how to answer those questions, just because they rushed through them. They try to solve them in their head. They didn't show their work. They jumped right into their calculator and they gave up those easy points and then they have to go retake the SAT. So don't let that be you. Picking numbers, we're going to see how that works too. And if you're not already signed up for the SAT workshop series that I'm teaching through the library, let me just give you guys a link to that. Because everything that I'm doing today, I'm going to go into a lot more depth during the workshop series. Let me share that really quickly so I don't forget. And I will try to put that into the email that I'll send you to as a follow-up email today. So picking numbers, whenever we see that all the answer choices are variables, we can generally back solve and pick numbers and then answer it that way. When you are picking numbers, make sure you're not picking numbers that are multiples of each other. So I'm not going to pick 4 and 8. Those would be horrible numbers to pick. I would pick numbers like 2 and 3 are my favorite numbers to pick when I'm just plugging in my own numbers. Mean, median, mode, and range. So the mean is the average. We just add up the numbers and we divide by however many there are. The median is going to be the middle number when we rearrange the numbers from smallest to biggest. The mode is going to be the number that appears the most. It's possible for there to be no mode if each number is just appearing one time. And then the range is going to be the difference between the smallest number and the biggest number. So just keep those in mind. The conjugate. So the conjugate we're going to use whenever we see radicals or complex numbers in the denominator. So if I see a question that has 2 plus I over 3 minus I, or let's say we had 1 over 2 plus the square root of 3, I need to use the conjugate. So I'm going to look at what's in the denominator, and I'm going to multiply both the numerator and the denominator by what's in the denominator, but I'm changing the sign. So right here, I have a negative, and down there, I have a positive. So for this first one, my conjugate of 3 minus I would be 3 plus I. And then I would have to multiply both the numerator and the denominator by that. So remember, because I had a negative, now it needs to be a positive for the conjugate. And for the one with the radical, I would multiply by 2 minus the square root of 3. And in the numerator, I would also have 2 minus the square root of 3. With the raise of hands, how many of you have used your graphing calculator for imaginary numbers or complex numbers to rationalize them? How many of you have done that? Quite a few. That's awesome. And we're going to look at how to do that too. Domain and range. For domain, we're just going to look at the x-axis. And for the range, we're going to look at the y-axis. So if I have a parabola here and I want to know, hey, what is the range? I'm going to say, let's say this is 3. So it's going to be positive 3 to infinity, because I'm just looking at the y-axis for the range. And for the domain, I'm going to say it's negative infinity to positive infinity, because it extends indefinitely in both directions, or infinitely would be a better word for that. For domain, we also need to be careful with radicals, right? If I have any kind of variable under a radical, I need to make sure when I'm solving for that variable to plug my answers back in at the very end to make sure it's in the domain. Remember, we don't want a negative under a radical. Then for triangles, we are 100% of the time going to draw right triangles. They won't always tell you this is a right triangle. They may just tell you, hey, it's a triangle and one angle is 90 degrees. That's the same as telling you, hey, this is a right triangle. And whenever you see those words, right triangle or 90 degrees, your first step needs to be to draw it. It's going to make the question way, way easier than if you try to solve it without drawing. Similar triangles have the same proportions. Similar right triangles have the same trig ratios. So if I have a triangle over here, let's say this is a 3, 4, 5, and I say it's similar to this triangle over here, and this triangle is 2x plus 5, 3z minus 10, 5y plus 2z, and I want to know, let's say this is triangle ABC, and this is triangle DEF, and I tell you these two triangles are similar, and I want to know, hey, what is sine of E? I can completely ignore this triangle. It doesn't matter because sine of E is going to be equal to sine of B because they're right triangles, so they're going to have the same trigonometric ratios if they're similar. So I could say that sine E equals sine B, which is just opposite over hypotenuse, which is just 4/5. So it's really important to know that. And then our last little fun fact for triangles is that whenever we have a circle and we have a triangle inside of that circle, and the legs of that triangle are the radii, we actually have an isosceles triangle, where the sides, we have two sides that are congruent and two angles that are opposite those sides that are also congruent. So this is just a crash course in what do you need to know about triangles for the SAT. Let's look down here, equations for a line. So equations for a line, oops, I didn't even know what that is. There we go. Equations for a line is the bread and butter of the SAT. So you are 100% guaranteed to see this on test day, and you need to know it really, really well in order to demonstrate your aptitude to the College Board on test day. So we have slope-intercept form, which is just y equals mx plus b. Remember that m is your slope and b is your y-intercept. Standard form is going to be ax plus by equals c. And then point slope form is going to be y minus y1 equals m times x minus x1. So point slope form we would use if we're given the coordinates of 2 points, right? We could find the slope and then plug in one of those coordinates. Standard form, we can easily see, hey, what is going on with that line? But our most convenient form to use will be the slope-intercept form. So in general, if they give me the equation of a line in standard form, I'm going to switch it back to my slope-intercept form because it's just going to be way easier to use. A little hack that you can use for standard form to find the slope is that the slope for standard form would be negative a over b, or negative a to b. That ratio is going to be your slope for standard form. And then your y-intercept for standard form would be c over b. You can memorize that if you want to. It's not required though. You can still get there by just manipulating the equation and putting it into y equals mx plus b form. Let's go over here. So parabolas will be another really core concept for the SAT. The SAT absolutely loves parabolas. And if you know the different ways to express a parabola, you're going to be in really good shape for the SAT. So the vertex form is going to be y equals a times x minus h squared plus k. Remember that hk is your vertex for this form. Your y-intercept form is going to be y equals a x squared plus bx plus c. And remember that your y-intercept form is what you would use for the quadratic formula. And then the x-intercept form is going to be y equals a times x minus p times x minus q. And your p and q are just x-intercepts. And for all of these, our a is our leading coefficient. So it's our leading coefficient down here. And that tells us whether the parabola opens up or down. So if that leading coefficient is positive, it means the parabola opens up. It's a happy parabola, it's positive. Let's just give it two little eyes there. And if that leading coefficient is negative, think of it as the parabola is frowning. It's a really unhappy parabola, and it's going to open down. On the graphing calculator section, on the section where we can use a calculator, we can just plug in the equation and see whether it opens up or down. But on the SAT, we have that no calculator section. So it's really important to actually know these equations well so that you can use them. For x-intercepts, they can sometimes refer to them a little bit differently. Instead of asking for the x-intercepts, they can ask for a 0 or a root. That's going to be synonyms for the x-intercepts. And then our equation for the x value of the vertex is going to come from our y-intercept form. So our x value of the vertex is just going to be x equals negative b over 2a. And our a is just the a that we have up there, our leading coefficient. And our b is going to be the x coefficient. It's really important to know that equation. It's not a guarantee that it will be on the no calculator section. It only appears every couple of SATs. But if you don't know that equation and it happens to be on your SAT, you're out of luck. You can't really fudge that. So really important to know. If you get a vertex question on the calculator section, I would just find it in the calculator. And I will be showing you how to do that either today or during the workshops. The equation of a circle. How many of you know that the equation of a circle is automatically stored in this calculator? It's already in there. Does anybody know that you can find it? See one hand. Okay, so we're gonna, a couple more hands. So we're gonna look at that a little bit in a second. But for the equation of a circle, we still need to know it because it could appear in the no calculator section. So it's going to be x minus h squared plus y minus k squared equals r squared. HK is our center and r is our radius. PEMDAS. Everybody knows PEMDAS, I'm sure. I'm not even going to ask you to raise your hands because I have my fingers crossed that you all know what PEMDAS means. We're always going to form mathematical operations in this order. So whatever is inside of the parentheses, we're going to do first. Then we're going to deal with exponents, multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction in that order. I want you to note, though, that the parentheses are so important for the calculator. We need to be parentheses happy on any standardized test when we're using the calculator. So when in doubt, use your calculator. I will show you just for a second here on my graphing calculator. Let me just pull it up. How not using parentheses can really get you in trouble. It's going to take 1 second while this opens. Okay. Whoops. Let me share the graphing calculator. There we go. So if I want to find, hey, what is, let's do 3 pi divided by 2. That gives me 4.71, right? But let's do open parentheses 3 pi close parentheses divided by 2. That gives me 4.71. But what about in reverse? What if we did 2 divided by, let's do 1, or let's do 5 divided by 3 second pi. What does that give us? 5.23. What about 5 divided by, open parentheses, 3 pi? What does that give us? 0.53. So I don't expect you to remember, hey, do I need to put parentheses around pi when it occurs in the numerator or the denominator? That's way too much work to expect you to remember that, right? But I do want you to remember when we are dividing or we are putting things in our calculator, we're using parentheses 100% of the time. Don't get lulled into, oh, do I really need parentheses as illustrated by example 1 when I just did 3 pi divided by 2? I could think, oh, I didn't need parentheses, I'm fine. And then I did the very next one, 5 divided by 3 pi, and the one where I use parentheses is actually the right answer. So if I didn't use parentheses on the test and I got 5.23 and I circled that, I would get that question wrong. Not because I didn't know how to put in 5 divided by 3 pi, just because I didn't use parentheses. The same thing will be true if we're substituting in a number for a variable and we want to solve it. Let's say they ask you, what is negative 2 squared? What is x squared when x is negative 2? And we just say negative 2 squared and we get, oh, that's negative 4. Well, that's not the right answer. The right answer is negative 2 in parentheses squared, which gives us positive 4. So we need to be really, really careful with the parentheses on the SAT. Sometimes I meet with students, and the only thing standing between them and an amazing SAT score is using parentheses. So I want you all to be very, very careful with that. Let's see here. So I'm gonna go back on my iPad here. Okay, next, percentages. So percentage is going to be another guaranteed question on your SAT. Super important. I could pretty much start every single concept that's in this core concepts handout for math as this is super important. This is going to be on your SAT. But when I'm starring it, also, you should know it's super duper important. It is pretty much guaranteed to be on your SAT on test day. So for percentage problems, I am really nitpicky about how I want students to approach those questions, because I know if you approach it in my way, you will more likely get that question correct versus if you answer it in a different way. So whenever I have an SAT question and the original amount is not given, I'm going to pick 100. Doesn't matter if it's reasonable. If they say, Carla drinks X number of cups of coffee a day, and now she is drinking 20% more, and then she drinks less, blah, blah, blah. How did the number change? I would say that Carla, myself, drinks 100 cups of coffee a day, even though I would probably not be alive if I drank 100 cups of coffee a day. That is the number I would pick. So always pick 100 if the original number is not given. If they give you the original amount, don't pick a number, right? Don't do it. Percentage is just the part over the whole, or the difference over the original if you're looking at the percent change. Whenever I see increased by 8%, or I see sales tax, or I see growth, that is an increase in a percent. So if they say it increased by 20%, I would say that is 1 plus 0.2 or 1.2. And from that point on, I would use the 1.2. I would not use 20% or 0.2. It would become 1.2. If I see decreased by X%, or I see decay by a percent, let's say we have decay by 30%. I would do 1 minus 0.3. So I would say 1 minus 0.3, and now that's 0.7, or 70% of the original amount, and I would use that 0.7 from that point forward. I would no longer use the 30%. Factoring, let's look at this. So factoring, we have x squared plus 2xy plus y squared equals x plus y squared. X squared minus 2xy plus y squared equals x minus y squared. Whoops, didn't show my parentheses up there. And then x squared minus y squared equals x plus y times x minus y. Those are the 3 factoring rules that you absolutely need to know for the SAT. And here's how you're going to use them. If you see something that looks like it can be factored, you have to factor it. If you see something that looks like maybe you can expand it, you have to. So easy enough. But it's that recognition that's the hard part. It's knowing, hey, you see just something in this form in the question, and x squared plus 2xy plus y squared. Maybe that's x squared plus 6xy plus 9y squared. And you need to think, hey, that is factorable, and I'm going to factor it before I look at any other information they gave me. That's going to be my first step. And just identifying the first step is so key in succeeding on SAT math questions. If you start with the wrong thing, it can just make the entire problem way more complicated than it needs to be. Okay. Moving onwards here, I'm actually just going to do this part first. So y-intercept, x-intercept, and slope. Y-intercept is going to be an SAT favorite. So out of these, you may, in one math section, see a y-intercept question 3 or 4 times. You are guaranteed to get a y-intercept question on test day. SAT loves y-intercepts. So for y-intercepts, we can also think of that as f of 0, right? What is y when x equals 0? So we're going to think of that as 0 for x, and then a number or variable. And then for x-intercepts questions, we're going to think of that as a number or variable, comma 0. And then lastly, for slopes, we're going to think of it as rise over run, or change in y over change in x. A triangle just symbolizes change in math. And then y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. And if I am given a table and it gives me x and y like so, and I see zeros in the table, I'm always going to be looking for zeros in tables. I'm going to think of, oh, this first one gives me my y-intercept, and the second one gives me my x-intercept. I'm going to think about that before I even read the question when I'm given the table. And it just makes life so much easier when you know to look for that. Okay. Memorizing, I already said, super important. For graphs, we're going to look for the slope, the x-intercept, and the y-intercept all of the time. We're also going to make sure to look for the origin. Look for the origin. So if I'm given a graph, I'm going to make sure that this is actually 0, 0. The SAT is known to not make that 0. So we're going to be really critical when we look at graphs. We're going to look at what's the label for the x-axis, the x-axis, and the y-axis. We're going to look at the scale. The SAT also loves to give you graphs with different scales. So let's say this is 1, 2, 3, and this is 10, 20, 30, and you attempt to just solve that graphically for the slope. You're going to pick the wrong answer. What do I do to combat this? I rarely use the graph to solve for the slope. I generally always just go back to that slope formula of y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1, because that's the last question that I want to get wrong on an SAT, is just a slope question. If it's any question I'm going to miss, I want to make sure it's a really icky question that would have taken me 5-10 minutes to solve. I don't want it to be a slope question that I'm getting wrong. And whenever you read in the XY plane, that's SAT code for use your graphing calculator and graph it, or if you're in the no calculator section, draw a graph. And generally speaking, that's going to make the question way easier. Every now and then it happens where I read in the XY plane And then I keep reading and I think there's no way I'm going to be graphing this. This is really complicated. And then I solve it algebraically instead. But that is the exception. It's not the rule. So I'm not telling you always graph when you see in the XY plane, but definitely consider it and lean towards just graphing when you see that. We're going to come back to the calculator in a second. Or actually, let's just do it right now. I'm going to give you guys a poll on the graphing calculator. And let's see, for the graphing calculator, what you guys already know how to do out of some of this stuff. So the first question is if you've ever used polysmelt. The next question is if you've ever graphed inequalities in circles. And then the last question is, do you know how to use the graphing calculator to solve equations? So let's see here. Okay, so most of you have not used polysmelt, I think. Okay, so as far as graphing calculators go, you may have the model before this graphing calculator, which is fine. You can use that model instead. However, if you can borrow this one from somebody, the library, the Safety Harbor Public Library also has a couple of these calculators available for students to check out as if you're checking out a book. And I would totally, so if I were in your shoes and either A, I don't own a graphing calculator, or B, I have a different model of this graphing calculator. If your family can't afford to get you this model of the graphing calculator, I would go to the library and I would check it out, because it can make a massive difference on the SAT math section. So I'm just going to give you a quick little overview of things that the graphing calculator can do. And I'm not going to go super deep with it today because time, right? I'm going to go a little bit deeper into it as we go through those SAT workshops. But I do want to give you an overview of what the calculator can do. So let's go into test 10 and to the calculator section. And I just want to look for a question here. Where is it? Aha. So question 25 in the calculator section of test 10. So you guys should all be seeing this equation. So this can be solved by your calculator. You do not have to use substitution or elimination for this question. So in order to share my calculator screen, I need to take this equation away. So either jot it down really quickly so you have it too in front of you, or pull it up on your computer, or if you have this test already printed out, have it available. So I'm going to go into the calculator now. And we're going to solve that equation using the calculator. So I'm just going to go in here. I want to clear whatever I already have in there because I usually have something, and I do. So let me just clear that first. Okay. And I'm going to share my calculator screen. Okay. So on the graphing calculator, you would press apps, and let me just end this poll and share it with you guys too, so you can see the responses. So I press apps, which is right here in the middle of the calculator, and then I scroll down to polysmelt. And because I have two equations here, I'm going to go to some simultaneous equation solver. In this equation, I have two equations, so I want to make sure that's highlighted. And I have two unknowns, so I want to make sure that's highlighted. Everything else I generally leave alone. You can reset your calculator before you take a practice test in order to make sure none of these settings really are changed. So you just want it on the default settings. Then to press next, we're going to press the graph button. And then we're just going to fill in the coefficients exactly as written. So I'm going to put 2.4 and then enter, and then go over and put in negative 1.5 and then enter, and then 0.3, enter. Then for the next equation, I'm going to put in 1.6. And note that I am using the negative in parentheses in front. That is just my choice. I could also change the plus sign to the minus sign using the minus sign instead. So my y coefficient was 0.5, so I'm just plugging that in. And then very lastly, I'm putting in negative 1.3, enter. And to solve it, I'm going to press the graph button. And that gives me x is negative 0.5, which is answer choice A. And it is the right answer for this question, that x is negative 0.5. How many of you have never seen that in a calculator before? That it will just solve it. Usually teachers don't share this in the classroom because they want you to know how to do it the long way. And I partially agree with that, because in the no calculator section, you have to have other strategies. But in the calculator section, this is such an easy point for you guys. In polysmelt, so to go back here, I just pressed second mode. Let me just go back second mode again to the home screen before I show you the next one. So we would go to apps and then go down to polysmelt again. I could just press the number 9 here too, and it would open polysmelt. And now we're gonna go to polynomial root finder. So this we're going to use to solve any quadratic. So let's say I already have a quadratic entered in here. I want to figure out what is x if I have negative 4.9 x squared plus 25x. Here I have no constant term, so that's why I put 0. And then when I press solve, it gives me what x is equal to. So I can use polysmelt to also solve any quadratic. With the raise of hands, how many of you have ever used math? And we're going to go up 1 to numeric solver. How many of you have never used numeric solver? You can just raise your hand if you've never seen this. Okay, so in your practice test, let me actually stop this share just for a second. And I'm going to share the question that we're going to use it for, because it's just so, it's really awesome that we have this available to us, and it makes a lot of the SAT math questions just a lot simpler. So I'm looking at 21 here. And the moment I see question number 21, I'm thinking, I'm gonna use math numeric solver. I also sometimes call it equation solver. You can call it either one. And the reason I think that is because I have a linear equation here on each side. They say Clayton will mix X milliliters of 10% by mass saline solution with Y milliliters of a 20% by mass saline solution in order to create an 18% by mass saline solution. The equation above represents the situation if Clayton uses 100 milliliters of the 20% solution. So I'm just gonna cross out this Y and make it 100. And cross out this Y and make that 100. How many milliliters of the 10% by mass solution must he use? So they want to know what is X equal to when you solve that equation. And we're going to plug it into numeric solver and have the calculator solve it for us. So I'm going to go back and let's look in the calculator. So remember to get here, I just pressed math and then up 1 to numeric solver. And I'm pressing enter, and I'm just going to put the left-hand side of the equation in box 1. So I'm going to put 0.1x plus 0.2, open parentheses, times 100. And then press enter to go down to the second box. And here I'm going to put in 0.18, open parentheses, x plus 100, close parentheses. And then to have the calculator solve this, I'm going to just press enter. And then to make sure it's solving it, I'm going to press the graph button. And that gives me x equals 25, which is answer choice B, and that is the right answer. So equation solver is going to be super, super useful for us on the SAT. Let's see some other things we can do here. So I'm going to stop the share and share the test again, going kind of back and forth here. I'm going to stop that sharing too. Leave it on. Okay. Let's look at another calculator question in this SAT. Where did I see it? Aha, number 11. So the table above shows two lists of numbers. Which of the following is a true statement comparing list A and list B? The means are the same and the standard deviations are different. How do the means and the standard deviations compare? So you could solve this without using the SAT button on your calculator by adding up all the numbers, dividing by how many there are, and finding the means of each list. And then you can think about the standard deviation is the distance from the mean, the dispersal around the mean. So you can reason your way through this question without using the graphing calculator. However, with the graphing calculator, I would just enter that list of numbers into the calculator. So I would first always go and clear my lists that are already in there. So we're gonna go second mem, and then go to clear all lists, enter to clear them. And then I'm going to go to stat, edit. And I'm just gonna do one list right now, just for the sake of time, so that I get through everything that we need to for this boot camp. So I'm gonna put 1, and then 2, and then 3, 4, 5, 6. If I wanted to take the time to it, I can also enter the second list over in that list 2 column, but I'm just going to deal with list 1. To get out of the screen, I'm going to go second quit, and then I'm going to press second stat and go over to math. And here I can have the calculator find the mean of that list. So I'm scrolling down to mean and pressing enter, and then going second stat, list 1, enter, and it gives me my mean. My average is 3.5. And then I can also find the standard deviation. So I press second stat and then go over to math. Standard deviation is option 7 there. Press enter, and then second stat, list 1, enter that, and it gives me my standard deviation. So we can use the stat button to easily find our mean and our standard deviation for a list of numbers. Have any of you never done that before? Use the stat button just to simplify your life. This is something they do teach you if you take AP stats or stats in school, but it's very, very useful for the SAT. Let's say they gave you a question with the letter I, with complex numbers or imaginary numbers. So if I press second period down here, it gives me an I. And an I is just the square root of -1. So if I wanted to find what is 2 divided by 3 minus second I, if this was a no calculator question, I would have to multiply the numerator and the denominator by 3 plus I. But if I see a question like this one in the calculator section, I can just type it into my calculator exactly as written and then press enter, and it gives it to me rationalized. So the calculator multiplied the numerator and the denominator by 3 plus I for me. Okay, let's see other calculator things that you should know is in here. So let's go to apps and then go to Connects. So this enables you to graph circles, which can be really important. It also gives you the equation of a circle. But because there is a no calculator section, you have to memorize it. You can't just rely on, oh, my calculator has it. You don't want to give up that point. So this is going to be really useful to us. We can graph circles using this. I will just graph the first one For you, I already have some numbers in here. We'll just use that and let's press graph and boom, it grabs the circle. And then I can press the trace button and I can move around the circle in a counterclockwise direction. Let's see here. I just want to pull something up really quickly. Whoops. Give me 1 second while I pull this up. Make sure that I'm covering all of the graphing calculator things that I want to for today. So let's say, and I think I need to show you a different question to really have this make sense. So I'm gonna go to a question from a different test. Let's say we get this question. Ooh, oh, you can't see what I see. I need to share it. I'm looking at it, this circle question. This question's already worked out for us. We get this question on an SAT calculator section. In the XY plane, the graph of 2x squared minus 6xy plus 2y squared plus 2y equals 45 is a circle. What is the radius of the circle? This is a ton of work. We would need to complete the square for both the x and y in order to solve for the radius without using a calculator. But this question actually occurred on a calculator section of the SAT. And I'm going to show you how we would solve it. We would just plug in the numbers. So I'm going to go back to the calculator again. So I would go back here, so second mode to circle, and I'm going to go to the second circle equation here and just plug in those coefficients. So my x squared coefficient is 2. My x coefficient was -6. My y coefficient was 2. And then my radius, it was in the original equation equal to 45, but here I can see it's equal to 0. So I subtracted 45 from each side and I found that my constant then would be -45. So I can graph it and use the trace button to kind of move around to see what my radius is. Or I can go back here just to where I put in the equation and I can press alpha, enter, and it gives me both my center and my radius just by plugging in the numbers. Not really knowing any math, just knowing how to use the graphing calculator. So all I did there was I pressed alpha, enter. That's all we need to do. Okay, let's go back to our apps and we're gonna go to in equals. And in equals is something you just turn on in your calculator. It's kind of anticlimactic. You press it and nothing really happens, but something did. So I'm gonna go down to number 7 in equals and press enter. And mine is already turned on, so I'm just going to press continue. And this enables me, so let me go here. I can scroll to the left until a box now appears around Y1. And when I press enter, I can change that equal sign to an inequality symbol. So let's say it's less than or equal. So y is less than or equal to 2x minus 5. And when I press graph, it both graphs it and shades it. So I can put 2 inequalities in there too, and it will graph the solution for me. So let's say I go back and I put, this is greater than, let's do just -x. And it graphs that, and then I can see, oh, over here where both are shaded, that is my solution, right? So definitely a useful feature in the graphing calculator. Okay, let's see if there's anything else I want to touch on for the graphing calculator for today. I could spend hours diving into the graphing calculator, but at the very least, I want you guys, if I never see you again or you never see me again and you're not able to make it to those SAT workshops where I will go a little bit deeper into this stuff, I want to make sure that you at least know that this stuff exists in your calculator. So other basics we need to know about for the SAT. If we go to math and we scroll down to this X root, we can find any root. So let's say I wanted to find the 5th root of a number. I can just put 5 there and then put 225 in here, and it finds the 5th root of that number. I can also go to math and then scroll over to num and select apps. And apps is our absolute value bars. So I can type in an absolute value expression and it just finds the absolute value for me without having to think through those steps. I can also graph an absolute value equation. So let me just clear this and that one. And I'm gonna make this an equal sign again. Let's actually, so I generally just turn off an equals when I'm done with it. So I would go down to apps and then press 7 and then press quit. I like just turning it off. It saves time over having to go in there and change those symbols back. So let's say we wanted to just graph an absolute value. We could go to math, num, apps, and just put an X in there. And let's do it again for the next equation, but we're gonna do X minus 5. We're gonna graph these two and we can see the absolute value of X goes through the origin, that's our parent graph. And the absolute value of X minus 5 shifted that graph 5 to the right. So we can use that to figure out what our transformation is without using our transformation rules. And questions like this one will generally occur on the calculator section, not on the no calculator section. And then our last thing, and I think most students already know this, but we can press, let's say I found 50 divided by 2,500 and it gives me 0.02. And I needed that as a fraction that was reduced, not as a decimal. I can now press math frac and it gives me the reduced fraction. So just pressing math frac can do that. We may come back to the calculator again today because I could really spend all of our time together just on the calculator, but I want to make sure that we're covering all the other stuff too. Okay, so let's go back to our core concepts. Okay, so prime numbers and integers, these are just definitions that you need to know. You need to know them because they may ask you to express an answer as an integer. And I was on Khan Academy earlier this week. I like looking at it from time to time just to see what are they teaching students. And when you take practice tests on Khan Academy for the free response questions, when the question tells you to enter your answer as an integer, Khan Academy on the practice test gives you a hint that an integer is a whole number. It shows you put it in the form of like the number 6, something rounded, which on test day, you will not get that hint. You will just need to know an integer is a whole number, including 0 and negative whole numbers. And prime numbers are numbers that are divisible only by 1 in themselves, and it does not include negative numbers, and 1 is not prime. Probability. So the ACT can get a little bit more in depth with probability than the SAT will. For the SAT, for probability questions, you just need to know that the probability of something happening is the desired possibilities over the total possibilities, or the desired outcomes over the total outcomes. The word and is going to signal for you to multiply the probabilities, and the word or is going to be your signal to add the probabilities. So if they say, hey, what is the probability of Susie having both ice cream and cake tonight? If there's a 50% probability of her having cake, I would say that's 1/2. And because we're saying and ice cream, let's say for ice cream, it's also a half, we need to multiply because it's an and question. So that gives me 1/4 or 25% chance. If it's an or question, what is the probability of Susie having cake or ice cream? I would just add 1/2 plus 1/2 and then get 1, or there's 100% probability that you will have cake or ice cream. The SAT does not go into dependent and independent events and sample space and the more advanced probability questions. All you need to know for SAT probability questions is what I just told you, and it will come into play exactly like this. Another way you may see the word and would be both. That's going to be a synonym for the word and for probability questions. So what is the probability that you will have both cake and both cake and ice cream? There's an and in there, but maybe you'll see just the word both and no and. Word problems. This is a big one. You need to know what these words translate to in math. That of means to multiply, sum is addition, difference subtraction, product multiplication, quotient division. You also need to know that when you see what number, that is going to mean X. And if they say your y-intercept, right? You're gonna know X is 0 for your y-intercept. So these are just things you need to be able to translate from words to math. Okay, final page of our math strategy here. So area of a sector and arc length. I'm just, for the sake of time, going to copy these over for you guys. I want to get to some more problems. Whoops. So let's actually, we'll use this side of this guide for this. So for the area of a sector and for arc length, the sector is going to be a piece of the pie. So think of it as a pizza slice. And the arc length is just going to be a piece of the circumference. So the crust, a piece of the outer edge of your pizza. For area of a sector, we're going to need the central angle. And for arc length, we're also going to need the central angle. And you can see I have the central angles marked there. Both sectors and arc lengths deal with proportions. So we need to figure out what is our proportion of our central angle to the whole circle, and what is our proportion of the sector or arc length to the whole circle. So for sectors, we're going to use the area of the circle, because remember, it's a whole slice of pizza. So it's a piece of the whole area. And for arc length, we're going to use a piece of the crust, and it's the circumference that makes up that crust. So for area of a sector, we're going to put area of a sector over the area of a circle and set that equal to the central angle over 360 degrees or 2 pi. If they give you the central angle in radians, you can know it's radians. If you see a pi, then I would put 2 pi in the denominator. If they gave you the central angle in degrees, I would put 360 degrees in the denominator. For arc length, we're going to use the circumference, right? So it's going to be arc length over circumference of a circle equals the central angle over 360 degrees or 2 pi. You can also, instead of using the area of a sector to the area of a circle, you could find sector A to sector B over central angle A to central angle B. I'm going to move this up here. So we could say sector A is to sector B as central angle A is to central angle B, like so. That's another thing you can use. Same thing for arc length. So I note here pencil test. So the pencil test we're going to use to make sure that we set up the equations correctly. So I drop my pencil on my piece of paper and I make sure that the right parts match up. It doesn't really matter which one you end up putting in your numerator or your denominator, but you need to make sure that they match up correctly. So the sector is made up by the central angle. So when I drop my pencil, imagine this green highlighter line is my pencil. I need to make sure those two match up. And the area of a circle is made up by the whole 360 degrees. So that needs to match up. Whether you put those in the numerator or the denominator doesn't really matter, but we need to double check that those match up. SOHCAHTOA. if you have had Algebra 2 or Pre-Calc, you should already know SOHCAHTOA. In case you don't remember this, SOHCAHTOA is just sine, cosine, and tangent. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. And tangent is opposite over adjacent. So it's all with respect to that angle. Here, 4 is opposite that angle, and 3 is adjacent to it. And then the hypotenuse can never be the adjacent. So it's always going to be the other one next to it. I also want you to know that sine theta and cosine theta of complementary angles are equal. Remember, complementary angles are angles that add up to 90 degrees. Supplementary angles add up to 180. And then it's good to know that tan theta is sine theta over cosine theta, but you don't absolutely have to know that for the SAT. Here I have a little trig table. How many of you have ever created the trig table? Anybody created this before? The trig table? Nobody. Okay. So for the trig table, let's say we are in the no calculator section, and they are asking us to figure out what is sine of 60 degrees. And you think, I don't have a calculator. I don't know what sine of 60 degrees is. You can really quickly set up this trig table. So we're going to just put the first angles in the first quadrant of the unit circle. So I would put 0, 30 degrees, 45 degrees, 60, and 90 degrees up top. And then I put sine theta first and then cosine theta over here. It's really important to put them in this order. You can think of sine comes first in SOHCAHTOA, or you can think of sine goes first because it's selfish. That's how I remember it. And now the really easy part comes in to recreate this. We're first going to start with 0 and count up to 4. So I'm going to go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm going to count down from 4. So I'm going to go 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Then everything gets a square root. So I am going to put a square root over every single thing I just wrote out. And then I'm going to divide everything by 2. So divide it by 2, divide it by 2, everything gets divided by 2. And now I have sine and cosine for every angle in the first quadrant of the unit circle. So sine of 60 degrees is the square root of 3 over 2. Cosine of 60 degrees, oops, is just a half, right? Square root of 1 is 1. So that would just be 1/2. And if I wanted to convert my degrees to radians, let's say they were super mean and they wanted to know what is sine of pi over 3, and you don't have it memorized that sine of 60 is pi over 3, at the beginning of every math section, they give you this reference information. And they down here tell you that there's 360 degrees and 2 pi. So that is something that is given to you that you can use. While we're on this section, I like students to still pretty much have this information memorized, even though it's given to you at the beginning of each section, because time and time again, students will forget that this information is there, so they won't use it, or they will go back and see, oh, did they give me that equation? Oh, the circle equation isn't given. You need to be way more familiar with this stuff before you go into test day than that. So they give you the area of a circle and the circumference of a circle. Area equals length times width for a rectangle. That would be area equals side squared if it was a square, right? Then they give you the Pythagorean theorem, c squared equals a squared plus b squared, special right triangles, which is super useful if you don't want to deal with using the Pythagorean theorem in the no calculator section. And then they give you all these shapes. So I want you to note the first one is a rectangular prism. Then we have a cylinder, a sphere, a cone, and a rectangular pyramid. And they also give us, like I said before, that there's 360 degrees and 2 pi. And they tell us there's 180 degrees and a triangle. So definitely spend time memorizing this stuff, getting familiar with it before test day. Okay, other things we need to know here. Variable exponents, and we'll see this more in the workshops too. For the SAT, whenever we see variable exponents, so let's say I saw 3, let's say 3 to the 5th equals 9x. My very first step here when I see variable exponents is making that 9 a 3. So I would say 3 to the 5th equals 3 to the 2x. Now that I have bases that are the same, I can just set those exponents equal to each other. So I can say 5 equals 2x and solve for x. You need to know some distance equations. So distance equals rate times time. That would be if a car is traveling. And distance also equals the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. That's going to be giving you the radius of a circle if you're given the center and an endpoint, or if you just need to find the distance between two coordinates, we would use that. Midpoint formula we looked at earlier. Let's see what else is on here. Parallel lines. So remember for parallel lines, and I'm just going to erase this so it's a little clearer for you guys. Alternate interior angles are equal. Alternate exterior angles are equal. So let's make this one x and this one x. Corresponding angles are equal. So these two correspond because they're both on the same side of the transversal and both above each parallel line. And then vertical angles are equal. And vertical angles are angles that are across from each other formed by the same two lines. So that's going to be an easy way to remember that, and you do need to know this for the SAT. You also need to know that supplementary angles add up to 180 degrees, like I mentioned before. And here we have a straight line, right? X and Y here form that supplementary angles. So X plus Y would equal 180 degrees. Okay. I, like I mentioned before, is just a square root of -1. You can use your calculator for I. On the SAT, most of the time, you probably won't need to use the conjugate. You can just treat I as a variable. So don't be scared when you see a question with I in it. And then absolute value, I already showed you guys how to use your calculator for absolute value. When we're solving absolute value expressions without a calculator, we're going to use these steps. So we're always going to isolate the absolute value expression first. And then when we remove those absolute value bars, we need to set it equal to both a positive and a negative, and then solve two equations for it. Okay, let's see here. No solution versus infinite solution. This is going to be the hardest SAT math questions for both no calculator and calculator. We'll deal with this concept. Doesn't mean that the question itself is hard. It means conceptually it's hard, and you need to rely on this to get through those questions. So no solution will be parallel lines that have the same slope. And infinite solutions are lines that are two lines right on top of each other, and they touch an infinite amount of time. So they have infinite solutions. Remember, the solutions of two lines are where they intersect. So if two lines have infinite solutions, then it means they intersect an infinite number of times. So it's the same line. So they're going to have the same y-intercept and the same slope. And whenever you see perpendicular slope, you're going to take the negative reciprocal of it. Okay. Two final things on here: quadratic formula and the discriminant and the exponent rules. And then I'm going to give you guys just a little mini break before you do just a couple of math questions and we dive into the reading and writing sections. So for the quadratic formula, of course, you can use polysmelt, right? If it's a calculator section to answer those questions for you. But you still need to know the quadratic formula because of that discriminant, because of the no calculator section. So the discriminant is going to be what's under the radical of the quadratic formula, that b squared minus 4ac. And when it's positive, you're going to get 2 real solutions. If it's negative, you're going to get no real solutions. And when it's equal to 0, you're going to get 1 real solution. And the SAT is kind of tricky whenever you need to use the discriminant. They won't tell you use the discriminant for this question. Instead, they will say, for what value of C does it give you no real solutions? And you need to know, oh, it's going to have to need to be a value that makes that negative. So whenever you see how many solutions, you see 0 solutions, no solutions, 2 real solutions, you should be thinking, oh, that's the discriminant. And then very last here are our exponent rules. And this will be in the email that I sent out with the key too. So don't struggle to write all this down. So a to the 0 is equal to 1, as long as a does not equal 0. If a is 0, then a to the 0 would just be 0, right? Then ab to the x power, whenever we have parentheses, we need to distribute what's outside of the parentheses. So we're just distributing that exponent. And then a to the x times a to the y. Because we have the same base, a, we can just write the base one time and then combine the exponents. We can add them together. The square root of a is equal to a to the half. Note that this right here is basically the same as this, the nth root of a. And it's also basically the same as the nth root of a to the m. And this should show you a little pattern here, that whatever the radical is, so the square root or the n goes in the denominator. So whatever goes right here in the blue is your denominator, and whatever your variable or your number inside the radical is raised to. In this case, for each of it, it's 1, 1, and then m, right? That goes in the numerator. Then we also have your a to the x. I'm right. Let me erase this. I'm at this next spot here, right here. A to the x over a to the y. When we move that a to the y to the numerator, it becomes a negative exponent for the y. So whenever we move an exponent from the numerator to the denominator, or the denominator up to the numerator, it has to change in sign. Over here, a over b to the x, again, we're just distributing that x there. Then the a to the negative x, if I move that exponent to the denominator, it changes sign, so it becomes positive. Then the nth root of a times b, we can split those up and just make it the nth root of a times the nth root of b, and then a to the x, and then the y exponent outside of parentheses, we are just combining those. We're just distributing that y exponent with parentheses. And then the very last one also just shows you how to break up those radicals. Okay, let's take 2 minutes. So I'm just gonna pause it for 2 minutes if you need to run to the restroom, grab a drink, do anything you need to do really quickly. I'm gonna give you 2 minutes and then we'll hop back on here and I'm gonna have you do just a couple of math questions. We're not gonna get super deep into it. I'm going to get deeper in those workshops for practice test 10 math. So I'm not terribly worried about it today, but I do want to look at a couple of questions just to make sure that you can see the application of some of the things that I mentioned today for the core concepts for math. So I'm just going to put a 2-minute timer here, and I will be right back with you guys when the 2 minutes is up. Okay, so I want to have you guys answer just a couple of questions in the math section. And instead of assigning just a bunch to you to complete on your own and then us looking at it together, I'm going to pull up a question on the screen and then I'm going to give you just a minute to see if you can reason your way through the question and see how you would answer it. So let's see here. So let's do question number 23 in the calculator section first. So I'm just going to give you, and I'm going to look at my phone for a timer. I'm just going to give you a minute to see what would you do to answer the question. So if you can think of, oh, this is what I would do, but I don't have time in a minute to do this, how would you answer it or actually answer it? It's possible to answer this question in less than a minute. So let's have you guys try that. And I just have a timer for 1 minute. Okay, so for this question, the first thing you should notice is that there's a 0 in the table. So when y is 0, x is a. The next thing that's important is they tell us there's a linear relationship. So that means this is just y equals mx plus b, or ax plus by equals c. And I can see all those answer choices are in standard form. I think that's pretty icky. I don't want to deal with it, but I see, oh, they gave me my x-intercept up here. So if I want to see which equation represents the information in the table, my x-intercept is going to be the easiest thing to use. So whenever y is 0, x has to equal a, right? So a comma 0, when y equals 0, x equals a. So I'm going to go to my answer choices and I'm just going to plug in my 0. And this is where we can use plugging in because all of the answer choices contain variables. So I'm going to make each of these y's just 0. And a number times 0 is 0. So x equals a when y equals 0 for the first one. For the second one, we have x equal to 5a. That's not true, so b's out. 2x does not equal negative 5a. We just want x equal to a. So c's out and d would be out too. So this is just letter A for this answer choice. Super easy. When we just plug in the right answer, we plug in that x-intercept here. So then if we go on here, let's look, if there's any other ones in here. Let's actually go to the no calculator section for another question. Did any of you use just plugging in the 0 for that question that we used? That was your method of choice? You could just raise your hand if that's what you did. You just plugged in the 0. You're like, ooh, 0. I'm going to use it. Perfect. Let's look here at question 20. So this is the last no calculator math question. And I'm going to give you a minute again to see what you do with it. And that's a good way to gauge for SAT math questions if you're using the best way. If you think, I need to do this, but it's going to take me 5 minutes or 4 minutes to do it in that way, or I have no idea where I'm going with this, it's probably not going to be what you want to do. And then you want to take a step back and think, what is going to be the most efficient way to answer this question correctly? So I'm going to give you 1 minute for question 20. And this is in the no calculator. Okay, so the first thing you should notice for question number 20 is this right here, this u squared minus t squared looks just like the x squared minus y squared from the core concepts. Remember I said whenever you can factor something, you should. So I would zoom in on just that part to begin with. I would ignore everything else. Let me actually, this is a better way to show how to zoom in here. I would just zoom in on that. And then I would see u squared minus t squared factors to u minus t times u plus t. And then I would think about, oh, what else is given here? Well, I have this u minus t also in front, so I need to write that. And then they tell me u plus t equals 5. So I could say that, hey, this u plus t is just 5. And they tell me that the u minus t equals 2. So each of these u minus t's are just 2's. So this is really just what is 2 times 2 times 5. So what is 4 times 5? And that is 20 for this question. If you first try to make that u minus t 2 up here, and you say that this is equal to 2 times u squared minus t squared, and then you distribute that 2 and you try to figure out how to use the given information, it's not fun. It's way better when you start with the factoring, whenever you see, oh, that's an option here. Let's look at question number 18. I'm just going to give you a minute for question 18 also. Okay, so the first thing you should have noticed for this question is they say the increase in 10%. When we see that increase in 10%, that's going to be 1.1. Remember that 10%, we first converted to a decimal, and then we added to the number 1. So one purchased an antique that had a value of $200 at the time of purchase. Each year, the value of the antique is estimated to increase 10% over its value the previous year. The estimated value of the antique in dollars 2 years after the purchase can be represented by 200A, where A is a constant. What is A? So we just want to figure out what is A here. So we're going to say year 1 is just 1.1 times 200. So that's our value for year 1. For year 2, we're going to have 1.1 again times 1.1 times 200 from the year 1. Remember, this was our year 1 here, and that's going to be the value we multiply by for year 2. Some students at this point will actually figure out what is 1.1 times 1.1 times 200. That's doing too much work. Really, they just want to know what is the coefficient of A, and that's just 1.1 times 1.1. So here, we just need to figure out what's 1.1 times 1.1. So that's going to be 1, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 2, 1. There's 1 decimal and 1 decimal. We add those together. We got 2 decimal places. So it's just 1.21 for this question. And using that percent rule is really important. And then for one more math question here, I am just going to give you half a minute with this question. So this is a more advanced math question. It's the last multiple choice in the no calculator section. So it's an advanced math concept, but if you know the concept, it's a very quick question. So I'm just going to give you 30 seconds for 15. Okay, first thing you should notice here is they give us no solution. So no solution means that we have parallel lines that are never going to intersect. So they have the same slope, but different y-intercepts. So I'm just going to zoom in on my slope part of those equations. So if I have ax plus by equals c, my a and b give me my slope. And since they want a, right, they want this little a over here, I can pretty much just ignore my y-intercepts here. And I want my x and y coefficients to match because they have the same slope. So because I see a 2 down there, I'm going to give this y a 2 also, which means I need to multiply that -3 by 2, which makes this -6. And now my -6 matches up with my a right there. So the answer here is just -6. To show it a little bit better down here, because there's a lot going on there, I would have -6x plus 2y over ax plus 2y, and then my -6 and a are both my x coefficients, so a has to be -6, just to see that in a different way. Number 10, they give us the equation of a parabola, and then they want to know what is 0k. I'm going to give you 30 seconds again, just to think of number 10, how you would answer that. And again, this should jump right out at you. So when I see a 0, comma, a number or a variable, I should think, hey, that's the y-intercept, right? My k value. And then this parabola equation, you should also recognize as that's the y-intercept form. So 12 is our y-intercept. So k has to be 12. And they really didn't even need to give us that diagram. That was just extra information. Okay, let's look at some reading and grammar. So for the writing and language, I emailed out this grammar handout to you guys. And the grammar handout contains every single grammar rule that could appear on the SAT or ACT. And it's very much the same on both the SAT and the ACT, what you're going to see here. This handout is super important if you want to do well in this section. And the writing and language section on the SAT is going to be the easiest section to improve on. It's very very easy and straightforward. It's just practice makes perfect for this section. So this handout, I really want you guys to read through on your own in detail and look at, do you understand each of these rules? And if you don't, make that flashcard, highlight it, do whatever you need to do so that you can retain it. But let's just look through this really quickly here. So apostrophes make things possessive. So whenever you have an apostrophe S, that is making something possessive, and you need to make sure that it is actually possessive when you see that apostrophe S. So let's say you see the boys ball, like this little phrase here, and you're not sure, do you need an apostrophe there? It's sometimes helpful to replace it with a possessive pronoun like the word there and see if that works. So their ball, right? That sounds great. It's their ball. So we would need an apostrophe there with boys. Pronouns, especially possessive pronouns, never use apostrophes. It's already indicated in the pronoun whether it's possessive. So his ball, their ball, her ball, we're not going to use apostrophes because the pronoun itself is already possessive. This little word here, it's, is possessive, and it's with an apostrophe does not exist. It's not a real word, and you will sometimes see it on there, and you can just toss it out as an answer choice. Then we have there, and there. So the first there is they are. The second one is their, possessive. And then the last one is over there. Whose versus whose? The first whose there is who is. And the second whose is who's possessive. So it's a possessive pronoun. Semicolons and periods, you can generally think of semicolons as equal to periods. That means you need a subject and a verb on each side of a semicolon. You need something, a sentence that can stand by itself. We use semicolons in general to join two related ideas that don't really stand alone on their own. The SAT generally will not have you pick between a semicolon and a period because they are equivalent. So if you see both a semicolon and a period as an answer choice, you can probably just eliminate both of those answer choices. You are going to want commas after, however, moreover, therefore, those conjunctive adverbs. But whenever you see words like however, moreover, therefore, consequently, smack dab in the middle of a sentence, you need a semicolon before it, or you need to set them off with two commas. So you could have however, smack dab in the middle of a sentence, or semicolon, however, comma. But you cannot have a bunch of words and then just however, and then another bunch of words. That's going to be grammatically incorrect. Commas need to be before coordinating conjunctions. So for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. All need commas before them, especially when you have subject and verbs before them and after them. It's when you're joining two sentences. So you can think of a comma and equals a period equals a semicolon. Dependent clauses are clauses that cannot stand by themselves. So we have commas right after them to join them to the rest of the sentence. So if I said, after eating cake, comma, Sarah went for a run. That's probably not the best thing to eat before you go for a run. But that after eating a cake cannot stand on its own. So we need that comma for that dependent clause. That's our introductory phrase there. We also want commas around non-essential elements. So non-essential elements to test whether you need the commas. We're going to circle the commas and see what happens when we just cross out what's between the commas. Is it still an okay sentence? So London has some extremely modern parts. That's a complete sentence. So we can have that pair of commas there, making what's in between them non-essential. We're also going to use commas to separate items in a list. So sometimes when we have items in a list, this is just a convention to say, let's say, I eat apples, comma, berries, comma, and let's see, watermelon. Doing a comma and here, putting that there is just convention. So some people would put comma and then some people will just put the word and there. Both ways are correct, and the SAT or ACT won't make you pick between those. So you could say, I eat apples, comma, berries, and watermelon. That's going to be correct too. Let's move on here. So we're also going to use commas to separate adjectives whose order can be reversed. So the groaning, rumbling train, you could also read as the grumbling, groaning train. And to indicate that we can reverse those adjectives, we put a comma between them. We're not going to have two full sentences separated by only a comma. We need a comma and a semicolon or a period. We're also generally not going to have a comma right before a pronoun. That's a tip off that you need something more. You need a semicolon, a comma and, or a period. Let's see other things. So subject and verbs, you're generally not going to have a comma right before a verb unless you have a non-essential element right before it. And you're also not going to have commas between compound adjectives and compound verbs. So many tourists travel to London and Paris to visit museums and monuments. We don't have a subject verb and subject verb on both sides. So we would just use the and there. We wouldn't need a comma and. Before, after a preposition. So this one's important. I think of prepositions as sticky, meaning they like to be stuck to whatever word they're next to. They don't like sharing the spotlight with punctuation, especially commas. So if you see the word of, to, by, from, about, beneath, any kind of preposition, you are going to want to be wary of commas right next to them. You're also not going to see commas next to the word that. So that has no comma, but which is going to have a comma, except if you have of which or about which, then you're not going to have a comma, because remember, prepositions like the word of are sticky and they don't want punctuation next to them. You're also not going to have commas when you have two adjectives and you can't reverse the order. So here, stunning coral reefs, you couldn't really say coral stunning reefs. So you're going to not use a comma there to indicate that you can only say it the one way. Let's see other things. So commas and parentheses, generally we're going to stick to one type of punctuation. So we're not going to have a comma right before parentheses like this. And if we have parentheses, we're going to make sure we have a set of parentheses or a set of commas or a set of dashes. We're not going to have a dash comma or a dash parentheses. We're going to make sure that we're consistent with our punctuation. Colons. So colons come before lists and explanations. Colons, and this is something that's not taught as much, can also be grammatically, and I want you guys to underline this if you have it printed out, they're grammatically identical to a period or a semicolon, only if the second part is an explanation of the first part. So very, very rarely the SAT will make you pick between a comma and a semicolon, a period, and a colon. And you'll think to yourself, oh my gosh, how can they make me do that, right? This is not a fair question. But they will ask you that if what comes after the colon explains what came before the colon. And both of those have to be complete sentences in order to use it this way. You can use dashes to separate off non-essential elements the same way that we use commas. So we here, London, which is a very old city, remember that sentence? We can have a pair of dashes. And when we read that sentence without what came between those dashes, so we're just reading London has many new buildings, that non-essential element is not necessary. And we can indicate that with the pair of dashes. We can also use dashes before a list or to create a deliberate pause or before an explanation. So dashes are incredibly similar to both colons and commas, depending on how we're using them. So basic things to keep in mind for the SAT, the writing and language section, is we want to be both clear and concise. So we want to say things using the fewest amount of words possible. This means that shorter answer choices will generally be right. And if you are just guessing, you're going to eliminate those long answer choices, and those will not be your guesses. And you want to avoid redundancy. So if you've ever written an essay for school and you needed to meet the 1,000 words or whatever your teacher set as the requirement, maybe you just restated the same thing in different ways in order to hit that word count. Happens all the time in high school classes. But on the SAT, we want to make sure that we're not repeating information. We're clear and concise. We're only saying something once. So this redundancy is usually what I'm going to check before no change. This means if I want to select no change as an answer choice, I'm first going to make sure that what's underlined isn't already stated somewhere else. So the construction of the Great Wall of China was an enormous undertaking that occurred on a very large scale. So enormous is the same as large scale. So that's redundant. So we're not going to say that both. We're not going to say enormously huge, large, enormous, very large. We can just say enormous one time, so D for that question. Parallel structure, we want to be really consistent. So if I have a list with ing, I want to continue that list with ing. So I like swimming, hiking, biking. I like to swim, to bike, to hike. You have to be consistent in whatever you pick. So for parallel structure and even verb tense, I make what is underlined. So make what is underlined match what is not underlined. So sometimes things that are not underlined isn't our favorite. I personally avoid INGs on SAT grammar questions, but if I have a bunch of INGs that are not underlined, I need to make sure that I continue that form in the underlined part. Subject-verb agreement is going to be the bulk of the grammar questions on the SAT. And for subject-verb agreement, you need to become really familiar with your prepositions. If you don't know what they are, this is a good thing to Google and get your whole list of prepositions. There are words like of, about, between, in. Those are all prepositions. And prepositional phrases do not impact subject-verb agreement. So here, when I read illegal logging in Mexican forest, I'm going to cross off that prepositional phrase and just read illegal logging have. And that's obviously wrong. So I know that have has to be a has. But if I read it with the prepositional phrase, illegal logging in Mexican forests have resulted. Doesn't sound bad because we have that plural forest right before the verb, and the SAT loves doing that. So we're going to avoid that by eliminating our prepositional phrases. Pronoun agreement. So whenever you see a pronoun, so that's going to be he, she, it, them, they, it, you're going to make sure to go and find whatever the pronoun is referring to and make sure it matches in number and gender. So here we have painter Frida Kahlo was best known for her portraits. It was strongly influenced by indigenous Mexican culture. It refers to the portraits. So it needs to be plural. It needs to be they. Verb tense, we want to really make sure to, like I said before, make what is underlined match what is not underlined. So we want to stay consistent with whatever the verb tense is. And whenever you see a time reference, immediately think tense. So if they say in the 1800s, oh, it's past tense. If they say in 2100, oh, future tense. So have that in the back of your mind. And then I think that's really it. Oh, who, which, and whom. So who versus whom, super important too. I like to think of who as active and whom as lazy. So who does things and whom is lazy. So let's say I asked you who or whom left the door open. Well, who or whom did something here? They physically left the door open. So it's going to have to be who. But if I asked you for who or whom did you buy that gift? You are the one who bought the gift, not who or whom. They're just hanging out in that sentence. And we have a tip off here, this preposition. So when we have that preposition tip off too, it's more likely going to be whom, and whom is lazy here, whom didn't do anything. It's you who bought the gift. So we're gonna say for whom with an M did you buy that gift? Dangling and misplaced modifiers. So whenever we have a little introductory phrase and then a comma, and then what comes after that comma is underlined, we need to be really careful to make sure that what came before the comma correctly modifies what came after that comma. So born in Mexico City in 1907, self-portraits. Are self-portraits born? No, right? So we need a person right after that comma. And that helps you to really quickly zoom in on the right answer choices. Let's see here. This is probably what I hear on a daily basis, most often used incorrectly. Me or I. For some reason, there was a memo sent out at some point in society that using the word I is going to make you sound smarter. So people use the word I incorrectly all the time. They will say, let's say, my friend gave my brother and I a new car. Can't write anymore. A new car. They'll say that, but it's not right, because if I take out my brother and I just read my friend gave I a new car, it just grates, right? It's like fingernails grating on a chalkboard. It's not right. So really this should be my friend gave my brother and me a new car. So you need to make sure that it is, when you take away the and part, that it still makes sense. Let's look at another example here. Last year, my mother and me attended. So it would be last year I attended, right? Then the rest you can read through on your own. They're not going to be as frequently tested. Let's go back here to our core concepts. So if you look at the writing and language section here, this is basically a summary of the handout we just looked at. So everything here you can see in more detail in that handout. Something to note though, here where I have pick one, if you see the option of picking between the words like and as, we're always going to pick as if we have a choice instead of picking the word like. Another thing I want you to note here is the very first part where I tell you, beware. So whenever I'm between two answer choices, I am going to be less likely to pick long answer choices or answer choices that have an ing or the word being, it, or was in them. The worst offenders here will be the words being and it. Doesn't mean they will never be the right answer choice, but it does mean if you pick an answer that has the words being or it in them, you need to make sure that you have a strong reason, you have evidence for picking that. Another thing, so something that is not covered in that handout we just looked at is going to be meaning questions. So meaning questions deal with moving sentences around, adding a sentence, deleting a sentence, changing a consequently to a however, etc., picking between those, or placing a sentence. So meaning questions require that you look at the context. So you need to read before and after, and you need to figure out the relationship. And this is another thing that I will go into more depth with in that workshop series as we actually look at questions. So something to note for those workshops here, for the workshop series, you will get a homework assignment before each workshop. So that will be a practice test for you to work through on your own. And then I will send out a link where you can submit any question numbers that you would like me to go over during the workshop. So questions that are specific to you. And that populates into a spreadsheet for me so I can see which questions students struggled with the most, and then I prioritize those during the workshops. Okay, so reading strategy. I saved this for last because it's the simplest section out of the SAT, outside of improving your reading skills. So reading more, there's not really a ton to know about the SAT reading section. So one of the first things I want to note here, because you guys all have some time before the next SAT. If you go to my website and then carlaberry.com/read, you'll get access to the Mensa reading list. So these will be books that are a little bit more advanced and will be really good prep for you to improve your reading speed and comprehension before test day. Something to note when you are reading more, and especially when it's your first time really reading more advanced material, is that the first time you read a more advanced book, so let's say you're reading a Jane Austen book for the first time, you may barely understand anything, and that's okay. If the first time you read it, you are just trying to stay awake and not fall asleep, or you need to consult Wikipedia to even see what's going on, that's okay. But the more you push through and the more advanced books you read, the better you'll get at it. And then you will find one day that you're reading it and it's not that boring and you actually understand what's going on. But it's really something to just push through. Aim to read about a book a week until you take the SAT, and you'll really see a benefit of that on test day. Someone asked, for parallel structure, would you say I like to swim, to bike, and to hike and to bike, or I like to swim, hike, and bike? So on the SAT, you will see that to in front of every word, or you'll see the ing at the end of every word. They are pretty clear on that. You won't really see to swim, hike, and bike with the to just written one time. Just to answer that question. Okay. So for reading, first thing we're always going to do is read the introduction. And the introduction is going to be this part at the very beginning. So here we have this introduction says this passage is adapted from the Caliphs of Baghdad, Georgia, and novel. If we look at our next passage, it says this passage is adapted from David Owen, The Conundrum. how scientific innovation, increased efficiency, and good intentions can make our energy and climate problems worse. So the first introduction we looked at barely gave us any information, right? It wasn't a lot for this passage up here. Hopefully this doesn't make you car sick when I'm scrolling up and down. So this first one we looked at barely gives us anything. But the second one gives us a ton of information that's going to make it way easier to understand the passage. So always start by reading the introduction and see if you can figure out your who, what, when, where, and why from that. And that will give you a little bit of a framework before you dive into the questions. The next thing I want you to do is zoom out. And remember, zooming out is the exact opposite from what you did for the math section. So when we're zooming out, we are looking for two things. We're looking for the tone and the main idea. And that's going to be the golden key that unlocks SAT reading questions. No right answer, no correct answer will ever contradict the main idea or the tone. Like, just process that for a second. No right answer will ever contradict the main idea or the tone. So you can use that as a test when you're looking through the answer choices to see, does this fit the main idea? Does this fit my tone of positive, negative, or neutral? And if it doesn't, you can toss that answer choice out. So remember that the tone is the author's attitude. Is the author really excited about it? Are they really positive? And another thing to note about the tone is you can have more than one tone in the same passage. You can have a different tone in some paragraphs. So let's say the author is talking about all the benefits of something and they're so positive about it. And then in the last paragraph, they talk about some of the negative aspects about it. And maybe they're a little bit more reserved and they're a little bit more negative. So you could have a different tone in a different part of the passage. And we would use that other tone if a question specifically asks you about that final paragraph, then I would use that negative tone. But if the question asks me about the passage overall, then I'm just going to use the positive overall tone. I'm not going to be distracted by the author's negative moment towards the end. Next, so in order to find what is the main idea, what is our tone, we're going to look for the word but, or words of contrast. They show us shifts in what the author is trying to say. And whenever we see that word of contrast, we want to make sure we're paying attention to what comes after the word of contrast. If my father came to me and said, Carla, I am going to give you $1 million, but actually, I am not going to give you $1 million. You will just have to wait to see what you inherit one day, and I may just donate everything to charity. I am not getting $1 million today, right? It doesn't matter what came before the but. It's what came after the but that's really true. And you're going to see when you start looking for the word but, you'll see, oh my gosh, this appears all the time on SAT reading passages. And this appears all the time in news articles, even when you're reading them. Let's look at this passage here, the second passage. Building good transit isn't a bad idea, but it can actually backfire if the new trains and buses merely clear space on highway lanes for those who would prefer to drive. Needless to say, those ideas are not popular, but they're necessary because you can make people drive less in the long run by taking steps that make driving more pleasant, economical, and productive. Look here at the very end. No one ever promotes a transit scheme by arguing that it would make traveling less convenient, even though, from an environmental perspective, inconvenient travel is a worthy goal. If we look at the passage that came before, you'll also note the word but, and although, and even the word not can be used as a word that's a word of contrast, not this, but that. um, to show you what are the parts of the passage that the SAT wants you to see as important. So when we started today, I told you that I've been doing this for over a decade. So I've been doing this for a long time. And back when I first started teaching students how to tackle the SAT, I taught them to look for the word but and however and although. And it always was just so amazing to me how it simplified passages to look at those parts. And I've kept on waiting for the SAT to stop using the word but, however, although, and they have not. It's just too convenient for them to use it. So you can expect that on test day. It's extremely rare to see a passage without those words of contrast on the SAT. It happens from time to time, but it's very rare. And when that happens, usually you will see the word not instead of the word but all the time in a passage where you can't find a single but. So I already said we want to read the introduction. We're going to zoom out to find our tone and our main idea. While we're finding our tone and main idea, we're going to be looking for the word but. We are also going to strategize before we start reading or skimming. So there are many different ways to approach SAT reading, and no way is really wrong. What would be wrong would be to try out your way for the first time on test day instead of taking practice tests and seeing what works for you. So some students like reading the questions first and then just going and finding that information in the passage. Some students skim the passage first, then go to the questions, and then only read the parts that the questions refer them to in detail. That's my preferred strategy. Some students barely read at all and just go to the questions and hunt. Like I said before, some students read the passage in detail and then just go to the questions and they're able to retain all that information. I don't advise that strategy. I generally advise whatever you pick to first just be skimming the passage and use the word but and other words of contrast as kind of speed bumps to slow down and pay attention to what's going on. So whenever I see that word, I'm like, oop, I need to slow down. Okay, what's going on here? And then I move on. We can also map the passage. So if you read the passage and you see, oh my gosh, there's a lot of people mentioned here, and there's a lot of things going on in these paragraphs, you can write in the margins, this is where I can find that information, and then don't try to necessarily understand the information fully. Maybe you won't have a question on that part. So if I look at this test 10, there's that first passage here, and then we have that whole like back part, like the end of this passage. And there are barely any questions on any of this that comes towards the end of the passage. I think there's one or two, maybe one question on that. Someone asks, what about skimming the questions to know what you're looking for and then reading? That's a great strategy too. And a lot of students use that. And if you're able to practice that and you see it works for you, totally do it that way. For the reading section, remember for math, I told you sometimes you need to skip questions and come back to it. For the reading section, sometimes you need to skip entire passages and come back to them. So the first passage will always be a literary passage. It's going to be straight out of literature. It's going to be fiction, most likely. Then your next passage is going to be a little bit related to economics or humanities. Then you're going to also have a, let's see here, another kind of humanities passage, maybe a science passage. So you're pretty much going to get the same passages, also a dual passage. As you're taking practice tests, if you notice, oh my gosh, I am great at the dual passages, do that first. If you find I am terrible at the literary passages, I always get so many questions wrong on the first passage, you need to decide, A, Is it because you're just warming up on that passage? And if that's the case, you can do a little warm-up passage before you take the real test. Or is it just because that's super challenging for you? In that case, you should save that for last. Use the time where you have more energy and you're fresh on passages that you enjoy. Same thing for if you start reading a passage. Let's say I start reading a passage and it's about quantum mechanics and I just think that's super dry. I don't really enjoy it. I may choose to save that for last. And if I start reading a passage and it's about penguins, I'm like, I'm totally going to read this penguin passage. This is really interesting. I like it. So it's okay to do the passages out of order. Also answering the questions out of order. So questions for passages aren't going to be easy, medium, or hard. Sometimes they'll give you a question that's about the main idea for the whole passage as the very first question. And you're just not qualified to answer that question yet. I would answer all of the questions and then come back to the question about the entire passage. Because each time I am answering those other questions, I am becoming more familiar with the passage overall. And then I'm also focusing on eliminating answer choices while I am looking at those questions. So if an answer choice contradicts or does not fit the main idea, it's out. If an answer choice is really offensive or extreme, it says something the author says always or never, and that kind of language wasn't used in the passage, then I can toss that answer choice out. Answering questions in your own words. So this is probably students' least favorite technique to approach SAT reading, but it also happens to be the most effective and the most accurate way you're gonna get on the SAT reading. So you have to physically cover up the answer choices and then think about what would you pick as the right answer. So answering it in your own words and then uncovering those answer choices and picking the one that best matches what you would have said. This does not work if you peeked at the answer choices. You can never get that blank slate back. So I recommend physically covering the answer choices and then thinking, in the simplest way, how would I answer this? And then match it to whatever you would say. For dual passages, we are going to take them one passage at a time. So you're going to read the first passage or skim it, figure out the main idea for it, and then only answer questions for the first passage. Then you're going to skim or read the second passage, answer questions only on the second passage, and then very last, you're going to answer questions dealing with both passages. This eliminates the possibility of you, or reduces the possibility that you'll get confused between the two passages. So let's say passage A is about lemons and passage B is about all citrus fruits. If you get a question that has an answer choice talking about oranges and it's a question about passage A, you'll easily eliminate that. You'll think, oh no, this passage was a lot about lemons. I'm going to eliminate that orange answer choice from this. But if you've already read both passages, you're gonna have to go back and think about, wait, which one was the lemons passage? Which one talked about the oranges? And it can get confusing. So really answering them one at a time can make a big difference. And then very last thing I want to touch on here are line references. So for line references, we're also going to need to read before and after to figure out our meaning. Don't only read the line reference. You need to figure out the context. So let's look just what I mean by this, by line reference question. So here they say, they ask a question, right? You have to pick an answer. And then the very next question asks you to find the evidence. So that's a line reference, right? So we're gonna read a little bit around each of those line references before we pick one that matches up. Same thing for question 38 here, where they ask us, what does this word mean? We're gonna have to go find that line and read a little bit before and after to figure out the context of how it was used. So we have a couple minutes left here. 3 hours always flies by for me for the SAT. And I just want to give you guys an opportunity if you want to send any questions on the chat or in the Q&A, and just open it up to you of what are you most concerned about? Is there a particular question in this test that you would like me to look at? Any questions you may have that is SAT related or that are SAT related. Someone here, I didn't get to this question from earlier, had asked if you can use Mathway as a substitute for a calculator. I'm assuming Mathway is a website. Let's see here. And you cannot, because they will not let you use that on test day. You won't have access to your phone. So you really need to use a physical calculator, not a website or substitute. Any questions from you guys? Just gonna I'll give you 2 minutes and then I will check back in to see if you have any questions. Okay, while I'm waiting for questions, there are 2 things that will also be in the email that I send out to you guys today. The first thing is a link I'm just going to send you in the chat. This is a course evaluation. So this is an opportunity for you to anonymously give me feedback on the boot camp we had today. It's really useful for me when you guys fill this out, when I'm planning future SAT or ACT or college prep type programs. I also have a wait list on my website, and I will share this link with you guys too. I'm currently developing the first graphing calculator course for the SAT, and it's going to just be videos that are pretty much on demand instead of live. I've searched endlessly for a program that's already been developed, and I haven't been able to find one. So if you already know about a graphing calculator course somewhere on the internet, please send it to me. It will save me time. But in the meantime, I am putting the effort in to just develop that course. I also have the personal statement and application workshop tomorrow. So if you are a junior and you're going to be applying this year, that's going to be really important for you to attend. And I also have a smaller personal statement course that I'm putting together, and I'm just getting feedback from students so that I can group them together based on what their interests are and where they're applying and so forth, if I'm able to. And then the very last link I'm going to share with you guys are for the rest of my summer programs. So this little link here, carlaberry.com/summer programs, will take you to some of my SAT and ACT courses this summer. And if you put in Pro 25, you can get $25 off of any of these courses. And then of course, and this is a link I thought I was sharing when I clicked on the courses, I meant to go to the Safety Harbor library here. And then here we have workshops, carlaberry.com/SHPL takes you to all the workshops and programs that I'm teaching in partnership with the Safety Harbor Public Library. So I haven't gotten any questions from you guys. I hope that you learned something new today. And I also hope that I see some of you back here either for the courses I'm offering this summer or for the other workshops and boot camps. I really love doing this, and I hope that you feel a little bit more confident in what you need to know for the SAT after we've spent the last 3 hours together. If you think of any questions after we're done today, feel free to email me or text me. My number is at, I guess I can take that away. My number is at the bottom of the core concepts handout. And don't hesitate to reach out. So I'm going to let you guys go, and I will hopefully see you guys back in the future. Have a good week. Bye-bye.